Shakespeare alone. Candle flickering, quill scratching, genius pouring directly onto the page. Much like we see in Chloe Zhao's Hamnet, or even in John Madden's Shakespeare in Love. We love the image, don't we? It's a great myth. It's also basically fiction. Good morrow, good listeners, and welcome back to the Shakespop podcast with me, Koel Chatterjee. Today I want to talk about Shakespeare and his collaborators and why we need to stop thinking of Shakespeare as a lone genius. Before we even get to Shakespeare, we need to rewind and set the scene. Because early modern playwriting is operating under a completely different logic than how we imagine authorship today. This is not a literary culture built around books. It's a performance culture built around speed, spectacle, and survival. London theatres in the late 16th century needed constant novelty. New plays every few weeks. Old plays revived, revised, stitched together, cut down, padded out. A play wasn't a sacred text. It was a working document, something you could add to, argue with, or completely overhaul if audiences got bored. Playwrights weren't solitary artists. They were freelancers in a gig economy. They were paid by the play, not by the hour, and often only once the script was delivered. That's why collaboration wasn't just common, it was practical. If you needed a history play fast, you hired a team. If someone missed a deadline, another writer stepped in. If a play flopped, you rewrote it. If it sold, you revived it with upgrades. Authorship was flexible, porous, and frankly negotiable. And this matters because Shakespeare doesn't emerge against this system, he thrives inside it. He learns to write collaboratively because that's how the industry works. He revises because revision is expected. He writes for specific actors, specific venues, specific moments. So when we talk about Shakespeare's collaborators, we're not uncovering a scandal. We're just finally taking early modern theatre on its own terms. Because the historical reality looks much less like a lonely poet and much more like a modern TV writer's room under deadline pressure. Early modern theatre was collaborative by default. In fact, about half the plays written between 1580 and 1642 had more than one author. Collaboration wasn't the exception, it was the business model. So, if we really want to understand Shakespeare's genius, we have to stop treating him like a romantic poet born 2 centuries too early and start seeing him as a working writer in a frantic commercial industry. The closest thing we have to a smoking gun is Philip Henslow's diary. And when I say diary, I mean ledger. This was the account book of the Rose and the Fortune theatres, and it tells a brutal story. Plays were disposable, deadlines were savage, and speed mattered more than polish. Think less timeless literature, more content pipeline. Henslow regularly paid teams of 3 or 4 writers to bash out a script in a matter of weeks. If the King's Men were a production house, say HBO, then Shakespeare wasn't a lone genius. He was a showrunner, rewriting, collaborating, patching scenes, and making sure the play was ready before opening night. If Shakespeare is the name that survives, Christopher Marlowe is the talent who arrives first. By the early 1590s, Marlowe is already a star. Tamburlaine has exploded onto the London stage with a kind of poetic violence audiences haven't heard before. This is big, muscular verse, ambition dialed up to 11. And crucially, it's a style that completely resets what English drama can sound like. Shakespeare enters the industry in Marlowe's shadow. Stylometric analysis now shows that Marlowe co-wrote substantial portions of the Henry VI trilogy, particularly the earliest play. You can hear it in the rhetoric, the thunderous speeches, the obsession with power, the grand gestures of conquest. These are Marlowean moves. What's fascinating is what Shakespeare does with them. He doesn't just copy Marlowe, he domesticates him. He takes that bombast and starts applying it to interiority, to political anxiety, to character psychology. Collaboration here looks a lot like apprenticeship. This isn't a rivalry in the modern sense. It's 2 writers working under pressure, pooling their strengths. Marlowe brings prestige and edge. Shakespeare brings structure, pacing, and an instinct for stagecraft. The result is a set of plays that feel transitional, bridges between Marlowe's world and Shakespeare's. This dynamic is beautifully reimagined in Liz Duffy Adams' Born with Teeth, which stages their collaboration as a tense, risky, back alley writer's room for two. Scripts as political weapons. Genius forged under pressure. The data backs this up. Early Shakespeare absorbs Marlowe's muscular rhetoric, his bombast, his swagger. Shakespeare didn't emerge fully formed, he learnt on the job. And when Marlowe dies suddenly in 1593, Shakespeare is left holding a toolkit he's learned how to use frighteningly well. If Marlowe represents glamour and danger, George Wilkins represents necessity. Wilkins was a tavern keeper, a pamphleteer, and by most accounts a deeply unpleasant man. He wasn't part of Shakespeare's inner circle, and he certainly wasn't a literary heavyweight. But he was someone who could get words on a page quickly. Pericles bears all the signs of a play written under pressure. If you've ever read or watched Pericles and thought, wait, what just happened to the language? Congratulations, your instincts are excellent. The opening acts are episodic, repetitive, and oddly flat. Scenes rush past without emotional depth. Characters appear and vanish. The verse trudges. Then Act 3 begins, and suddenly, boom! The language lifts, the metaphors grow denser, the poetry deepens. Shakespeare has entered the chat. Mariner's speeches, in particular, sound unmistakably Shakespearean. Graceful, reflective, concerned with suffering and endurance. Stylometry confirms what readers have long suspected. This is a patchwork play. Wilkins likely drafted the opening sections, and Shakespeare was brought in to complete or rescue the project. What this tells us is important. Shakespeare didn't only collaborate with equals. He collaborated because he was reliable, because he could fix broken scripts, because he could turn an uneven draft into something performable. That's not romantic genius, that's professional excellence. By the time John Fletcher enters the picture, Shakespeare is no longer proving himself. He's protecting a legacy. Fletcher is younger, stylish, and very much the future of the King's men. His writing reflects changing theatrical tastes, smoother rhythms, lighter tone, more emphasis on romance and tragic comedy. He loves a feminine ending, letting lines trail past the iambic beat in a way that feels more conversational and less monumental than Shakespeare's earlier verse. When they collaborate on Henry VIII and the two noble kinsmen, the division of labour is remarkably clean. Scenes alternate between their voices almost mechanically. Scholars can map the handover scene by scene. What's striking is how unthreatening this collaboration seems. Shakespeare doesn't dominate, he doesn't disappear, he coexists. This looks less like teamwork under pressure and more like succession planning. Shakespeare easing himself out of full time writing while ensuring the company's future is secure. If Marlowe teaches Shakespeare how to write for power, Fletcher shows us how Shakespeare learns to let go. But there were also collaborators after Shakespeare. Macbeth often gets treated as one of Shakespeare's most tightly controlled tragedies. Short, brutal, no excess fat, which is precisely why the cracks matter. Most scholars now agree that Macbeth didn't remain untouched after Shakespeare left it behind. Around 1616, possibly for a court revival, the play was revised by Thomas Middleton, a playwright with a very different sensibility. The strongest evidence centers on the Hecate scenes. They feel off, lighter in rhythm, more sing-song, less psychologically dense. And crucially, the songs in those scenes appear almost verbatim in Middleton's own play, The Witch. This isn't plagiarism, it's recycling. Middleton is updating Macbeth using his own theatrical toolkit. What changes is tone. Shakespeare's witches are unsettling because they're spare and ambiguous, agents of chaos who speak in riddles and vanish. Middleton's additions make them more theatrical, more musical, almost more accessible. The supernatural becomes something you can stage spectacularly. And that matters for performance. Modern productions face a choice: cut the Hecate scenes to preserve Shakespeare's bleak minimalism, or embrace Middleton's contribution and turn the witches into something ritualistic, even operatic. The Royal Shakespeare Company has often chosen the latter, using music and choreography to lean into the play's afterlife as a performance text. The key point is this: Macbeth survives because it is adaptable. Shakespeare's script wasn't damaged by revision, it was kept alive by it. If Middleton shows us Shakespeare being revised by his contemporaries, Nahum Tate shows us what happens when Shakespeare becomes heritage, and other writers feel licensed to fix him. In 1681, Tate rewrote King Lear for restoration audiences, and he didn't hold back. Cordelia lives, Lear survives, the play ends with order restored and virtue rewarded. Tragedy becomes moral lesson. In fact, this is the version that we have seen quite frequently on the Indian stage and indeed in Bollywood films, for instance. For modern readers, this often feels like vandalism. But for Tate's audience, it was common sense. Shakespeare's ending was simply too bleak. Tate wasn't trying to compete with Shakespeare, he was trying to make him usable. And here's the part that really matters. Tate's version replaced Shakespeare's on the English stage for over a century. If you saw King Lear in London between the late 17th and early 19th centuries, you almost certainly saw Tate's Lear, not Shakespeare's. So, while Tate never collaborated with Shakespeare in life, he became one of his most influential collaborators in death. His Lear reminds us that Shakespeare's plays didn't survive by staying pure. They survived by being changed. When we talk about collaboration, we tend to imagine other playwrights. But some of the most influential collaborators on Shakespeare's work never wrote a single line of verse. Take, for instance, censorship as co authorship in the person of the Master of the Revels. Every play performed publicly in London had to be approved by the Master of the Revels. This wasn't a rubber stamp, it was active intervention. The surviving manuscript of Sir Thomas More shows this vividly. The censor's handwritten notes, essentially early modern red pen, demand cuts to scenes dealing with civil unrest and xenophobia. Lines are crossed out, speeches reshaped. Whether Shakespeare wrote those particular pages or not, the principle stands. Political authority directly shaped what could be said on stage. Silence, omission, and alteration were part of the writing process. In that sense, censorship wasn't just a constraint, it was a form of collaboration, one that shaped narrative, emphasis, and tone. And then there's the printing process. Shakespeare didn't oversee the publication of most of his plays. That job fell to printers and compositors, the workers who physically set each line of text in metal type. And they made choices. Compositor B, in particular, is infamous among textual scholars for regularizing spelling, adjusting meter, and sometimes altering line breaks to make the text fit the page. A line that scans perfectly in performance might be nudged into something slightly awkward on the printed page. This means that the Shakespeare we read is often already a collaboration between playwright and printer. The first folio isn't a neutral record, it's an edited artifact. And finally, the most immediate collaborators of all, actors. Shakespeare didn't write in abstraction. He wrote for specific bodies, voices, and personalities. When Will Kemp was the company clown, the comedy leant toward physical chaos. When Robert Armin replaced him, the fools became sharper, sadder, more musical. That's not coincidence, that's tailoring. Actors also improvised. They added business, jokes, asides, some of which appear to have made their way into later versions of the plays. The boundary between script and performance was porous, which meant that authorship didn't end when the ink dried. It continued in rehearsal, in performance, and sometimes even in print. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, but how do we actually know any of this? Some of it comes from documents, diaries, payments, title pages. But the real game changer over the last few decades has been stylometry, a branch of digital humanities that uses computational analysis to study writing style. And I promise this is much less sci fi than it sounds. Stylometry works on the idea that writers have unconscious habits. Not the big flashy metaphors, but the boring stuff. The words we don't think about. Function words like and, with, upon, ye, you. Rhythms we fall into. Grammatical preferences we don't even know we have. You can imitate someone's themes. You can imitate their imagery, but it's very hard to imitate their linguistic muscle memory. Using large digital corpora of early modern drama, scholars compare plays scene by scene, looking for clusters of these habits. One common method, used by the new Oxford Shakespeare team, is something called rolling delta analysis. Instead of treating a play as one block of text, the software slides across it in chunks, tracking stylistic shifts as it goes. When the statistical profile suddenly changes, that's usually when another writer enters or exits the script. This is how scholars were able to identify Marlowe's hand in the Henry VI plays, Fletcher's scenes in Henry VIII, and Middleton's additions to Macbeth. The evidence isn't one single tell. It's patterns stacking up across hundreds of tiny decisions. Crucially, stylometry doesn't replace traditional scholarship. It supports it. The strongest attributions happen when the data lines up with historical records, theatrical practice, and close reading. It's not about dethroning Shakespeare. It's about understanding how his voice moved through a collaborative system. And honestly, one of the most reassuring things stylometry shows us is just how adaptable Shakespeare was. He could write alongside Marlowe's bombast, Fletcher's elegance, Middleton's grit, and still sound like himself. That's not the loss of genius, that's mastery. Seeing Shakespeare as collaborator doesn't diminish him. It makes him more impressive. He could absorb Marlowe's fire, patch Wilkins's mess, hand over to Fletcher, survive Middleton's remix, and still sound unmistakably like Shakespeare. He's even changed by political authorities, printers and typesetters, actors and audiences. He wasn't an island, he was a hub. And maybe that's the real lesson here. English literature wasn't built by a lone genius in a candlelit room. It was built by a messy, brilliant commercial ecosystem of writers, actors, editors, and audiences, which feels surprisingly modern. If you're interested in doing a deep dive into Shakespeare and his collaborators, I'd suggest looking up Brian Vickers' Shakespeare co author, Robert A. Logan's Shakespeare's Marlowe, and Shakespeare, Computers and the Mystery of Authorship, edited by Hugh Craig and Arthur Kinney. I'll put up a more exhaustive reading list on my Substack page as usual, so you might want to subscribe to that. That's it for today's episode. For those of you following me on the Shakespeare podcast, I'll be back next week with a review of The Secret Life of William Shakespeare by Jude Morgan, which blends known facts with fictional depth to portray Shakespeare as an ordinary man becoming a genius, exploring his relationship with his wife, Anne Hathaway, Ben Jonson, and his struggles in Stratford before his London success. And the week after that, I'll be back with an interview here with Darren Freebury Jones to discuss his book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. That was a fascinating conversation that you will definitely want to tune into. I hope you enjoyed listening to me today as much as I've enjoyed speaking with you.